Not a monster, but a broken human. The dark secret behind a narcissist's soul. Let's start with this truth. Calling narcissists monsters or evil oversimplifies something far more intricate and far more human. In today's world, especially in the age of viral psychology and social media therapy, the word narcissism has evolved into a cultural weapon. What was once a technical term used in clinical settings is now hurled across the internet like an accusation. To many, it feels like a scarlet letter, a mark of shame. And in the midst of this noise, a growing movement of self-proclaimed, self-aware narcissists has emerged, arguing that they're misunderstood, that they're not villains but victims of society's judgment. They say, "We're not the problem, you are." But as most psychologists will tell you, this narrative, while emotionally seductive, is dangerously misleading. Dr. Ramani Durvasula, one of the foremost experts on narcissistic behavior, emphasizes that we cannot heal what we refuse to name truthfully. The issue isn't about calling someone evil, it's about understanding how their patterns harm others, and how those others can survive and recover. True psychological insight doesn't live in black and white labels like good or bad. It lives in the gray, in the uncomfortable space where empathy meets accountability. After 25 years of clinical work, I've sat across from both sides of the spectrum, narcissistic clients fighting their inner demons and survivors trying to reclaim their sense of reality. Therapy can reach both, but the focus must always begin with safety and truth. Survivors, especially those entangled in long-term relationships with narcissists, need context before they can heal. Without context, they gaslight themselves, minimizing the damage because the world keeps telling them to just move on. And yet, social media thrives on extremes. Algorithms reward outrage, not nuance. Online, narcissism is painted as pure malevolence, while in the real world, it exists on a continuum, from the charmingly self-absorbed to the dangerously exploitative. Psychologists distinguish between narcissistic traits and narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, but the internet rarely makes that distinction. The result? Survivors of subtle narcissistic abuse doubt themselves because it wasn't that bad, while others over-pathologize minor selfishness as full-blown pathology. Both distortions hurt the truth. Let's talk about severity because not all narcissism is the same. Some of you reading this may be in relationships that go far beyond emotional manipulation. These are relationships marked by coercive control, exploitation, and even physical abuse. In such cases, the situation has escalated into what psychologists classify as malignant narcissism, a hybrid of narcissism and psychopathy. Dr. Martha Stout describes this as a coldness of conscience, where empathy collapses completely and control becomes the central currency. These relationships are not only psychologically unsafe, they can be physically dangerous. Victims in these situations experience trauma bonding, where fear, dependency, and intermittent affection fuse together to trap them emotionally. Breaking free requires professional help, support networks, and safety planning, not just willpower. But many others find themselves in a more subtle hell, relationships that don't look abusive from the outside. There's laughter sometimes, shared routines, moments that feel almost normal. Maybe they co-parent well, maybe they still joke during dinner, and that's where the confusion begins. These are what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement dynamics, where positive moments are sprinkled between emotional neglect or criticism, keeping the victim psychologically tethered. Dr. Patrick Carnes, an expert in trauma and addiction, compares it to a slot machine. You keep pulling the lever, hoping for another moment of connection. It's not constant cruelty, it's unpredictable affection that makes the cruelty survivable. This gray zone is what makes narcissistic relationships so psychologically treacherous. Survivors internalize the cultural myth that relationships require compromise. They think, maybe I'm overreacting. But as trauma psychologists point out, these are not ordinary compromises. These are violations disguised as disagreements. When one partner continually invalidates your emotions, rewrites history, and punishes your independence, that's not compromise, that's control. Dr. Lundy Bancroft, who spent decades studying abusive dynamics, notes that narcissistic partners weaponize normal conflict resolution language. Every couple argues. Nobody's perfect. to normalize harm. It's a psychological sleight of hand that erodes the victim's self-trust. And what happens to the survivor trapped in that cycle? Over time, their nervous system becomes dysregulated. They live in what trauma specialists call hypervigilant calm, appearing composed while constantly scanning for danger. Their body confuses peace with the absence of immediate threat. Healing begins when survivors recognize that their confusion isn't weakness. It's conditioning. Their brain has been trained to interpret inconsistency as love. The antidote, according to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, lies in reestablishing safety through grounding practices, trauma-informed therapy, and boundaries that are enforced, not negotiated. On the other hand, narcissists themselves are trapped in their own psychological machinery. They oscillate between grandiosity and shame, unable to regulate their self-esteem without external validation. Their lack of empathy isn't just cruelty, it's a defense. As Dr. Craig Malkin explains, beneath the arrogance often lies a deep terror of inadequacy. But understanding that pain doesn't excuse the harm it causes. Compassion in therapy must be paired with containment. That's why clinicians who work with narcissistic personalities focus on emotional regulation and accountability, not validation of their victimhood. Ultimately, survivors must understand this. You cannot heal someone by being their mirror. You can only heal by stepping out of the reflection. Narcissists will always interpret your empathy as permission until you reclaim it for yourself. Recovery means releasing the fantasy that love can fix pathology, and instead cultivating gratitude for the clarity that pain has given you. So no, narcissists are not monsters. They are profoundly wounded humans whose wounds cut others to survive. But naming the wound doesn't mean you should live inside it. Healing requires boundaries, education, and, most importantly, the courage to stop trying to make sense of someone else's storm. As every trauma therapist will tell you, your peace begins the moment you decide that their chaos is no longer your home. It doesn't begin with a cruel insult or a slammed door. It begins with something far more subtle: a raised eyebrow when you speak, a dismissive sigh when you share a dream, a quiet humiliation disguised as humor at dinner. That's how narcissistic relationships often unfold. They don't always look monstrous from the outside, no horror movie soundtrack, no public outburst. But inside the relationship, the emotional erosion is constant and unrelenting. You start to shrink without realizing it. Psychologists describe this as chronic invalidation, a process where your identity, feelings, and boundaries are slowly erased until self-doubt replaces self-worth. Unlike the occasional difficult parent or partner who merely has bad days or outdated opinions, a narcissistic dynamic is something deeper and more insidious. It's built on patterns: entitlement, manipulation, rage, vindictiveness, arrogance, and emotional coldness. According to Dr. Ramani Durvasula, one of the foremost voices on narcissistic abuse, such relationships are not defined by occasional friction, but by the consistent absence of psychological safety. You learn over time that authenticity comes at a cost. Showing emotion, expressing need, or even having an opinion invites punishment through ridicule, withdrawal, or rage. The result is a kind of relational hypervigilance. You stop being you just to survive them. Victims of narcissistic relationships often describe feeling like they are walking through a psychological minefield. Every conversation feels like a test they can fail. You may catch yourself rehearsing sentences before you speak, or apologizing for things you didn't do. According to trauma psychologist Dr. Judith Herman, this is a hallmark of coercive control, a dynamic that rewires the nervous system to anticipate danger in ordinary moments. The mind of the survivor begins to equate silence with safety and self-expression with risk. Over time, this emotional conditioning creates deep confusion. If they're so awful, why do I still have good days with them? This confusion, that blend of fear and attachment, is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. It's the brain's attempt to reconcile two conflicting realities: the cruelty and the charm, the love and the fear. Narcissists are experts at creating this psychological tension. They alternate between affection and withdrawal, validation and contempt, to keep their victims disoriented and emotionally dependent. Dr. Patrick Carnes calls this trauma bonding, where intermittent kindness reinforces the bond, even as abuse deepens it. This is why victims often stay, not because they're weak, but because their nervous system has been trained to confuse relief with love. And yet, amid all this psychological chaos, the cultural conversation around narcissism has become toxic in its own way. On one end of the spectrum, we have those who excuse narcissistic behavior under the banner of self-awareness. On the other, there's a digital mob calling every difficult person a monster. But as psychologists emphasize, dehumanizing anyone, even narcissists, oversimplifies the truth and harms survivors in the process. Labeling them as evil can feel validating at first, but it also traps survivors in a binary worldview. If they're monsters, how could I ever have loved them? If they're evil, why do I still miss them? Healing requires complexity, the acknowledgement that someone can cause deep harm and still not be a cartoon villain. Dr. Ramani often warns against this emotional shortcut. Stay focused on the behavior, she says, because that's what defines the abuse. The gaslighting, the silent treatments, the blame shifting, the betrayals. These are patterns, not isolated incidents. They are the emotional architecture of narcissistic relationships. By focusing on behavior rather than labels, survivors regain clarity. It allows them to name the harm without having to vilify the entire person, a crucial distinction that helps them rebuild empathy for themselves rather than for the abuser. However, when social media tells you all narcissists are monsters, it sets an impossible emotional standard. You start searching for signs of monstrosity, for the mask to slip, for the cruelty to look unmistakable. But narcissists rarely fit that mold. They might be the parent who held your hand through childhood illness or the partner who made you laugh during a hard year. Those good memories become emotional landmines. Survivors often ask, if they were a monster, how could they have loved me like that? But as trauma therapists explain, this is exactly what keeps you trapped. The brain's desperate need to make the story coherent. Recognizing that narcissists are human, yet harmful, helps you break free from that illusion. Psychologically, this process is called integration, the ability to hold multiple truths at once. You can acknowledge the love that was there without denying the pain that came with it. You can grieve the good moments without excusing the bad ones. Dr. Pete Walker, a complex trauma specialist, describes this as reclaiming emotional wholeness. Survivors who learn to do this stop labeling themselves as codependent or broken. Instead, they start to understand that their empathy was weaponized against them, and that compassion is only healing when it includes the self. The ultimate goal of understanding narcissism isn't to diagnose others or to cling to outrage. It's to reclaim your peace. Knowing the psychological mechanisms, from gaslighting to projection, helps survivors detach emotionally, because what once felt personal now becomes clinical. You realize their rage wasn't about you. It was about their fragile ego. Their silent treatment wasn't punishment for your worthlessness. It was a strategy for control. Dr. Kristen Neff, a leading researcher on self-compassion, reminds us that self-understanding must always replace self-blame. You didn't fail the relationship, you survived it. So no, you don't need to see the narcissist as a monster to walk away. You just need to see them clearly. See the manipulation for what it is. See the pattern for what it's done to your heart. And most importantly, see yourself again. The person who's been there all along, waiting to feel safe enough to return. Healing doesn't come from hating the narcissist. It comes from no longer needing their version of you to feel real. The person you built a life with for 25 years, the one who once made you laugh until you cried, now feels like a stranger wearing the same face. And yet, they remembered your birthday this year. They even planned a surprise, inviting your friends, smiling as though the past, the betrayal, the infidelity, the tears, had vanished into thin air. That moment of warmth feels real. It is real, but so was the pain. And herein lies the unbearable contradiction that psychologists say lies at the very heart of narcissistic relationships. The intermittent reinforcement of love and harm. According to Dr. Ramani Durvasula, this back and forth between cruelty and tenderness keeps victims psychologically hooked. The brain clings to the good moments like a starving animal desperate for crumbs of affection, even when the overall pattern is deeply unsafe. When survivors try to cope with this confusion, Many attempt to simplify it, to label the narcissist as a monster or an evil person. Feels cleaner, easier, safer. But as many trauma therapists warn, the human mind resists binary absolutes when it comes to emotional attachment. Dr. Lindsay Gibson explains that this act of monsterification, turning the abuser into an inhuman villain, can temporarily protect you from grief, but ultimately distorts the healing process. The truth is far murkier. Most narcissistic individuals are not pure evil. They are profoundly insecure, emotionally dysregulated people whose behaviors cause immense harm. Recognizing this complexity doesn't excuse them. It simply helps you regain clarity and reclaim emotional power. Yes, some survivors live in truly monstrous situations. Coercive control, financial dependence, constant surveillance, even physical danger. In such cases, psychologists emphasize survival over nuance. Escape becomes the priority, not moral reflection. But for the majority of people trapped in narcissistic dynamics, the struggle is internal. It's about reconciling the kind gesture from last night with the humiliation from last week, the birthday party with the betrayal, the apology with the silence that followed. Therapists often call this cognitive dissonance fatigue, a psychological whiplash where love and fear coexist so intensely that your nervous system cannot tell which one is real. And that confusion is precisely what keeps victims stuck, oscillating between self-blame and denial. Healing, then, requires something far more courageous than labeling someone a monster. It demands the ability to see the entire painful picture, to acknowledge that yes, this person can carry groceries upstairs and still weaponize shame. They can comfort your child and still invalidate your emotions. Dr. Judith Herman, a pioneer in trauma recovery, often reminds survivors that true empowerment comes from integrating complexity, seeing the full truth without retreating into fantasy or denial. That's why one of the hardest and most essential tasks in recovery is holding both truths. They did kind things, and they also caused deep pain. This isn't about protecting the narcissist. It's about protecting you. As many psychologists stress, the goal is to replace emotional confusion with radical clarity, to see the relationship for what it is, fundamentally unsafe. Narcissistic dynamics don't allow you to be fully yourself because your truth is always a threat to their control. When you begin to express your authentic needs, they punish you with rage, withdrawal, or guilt trips. Over time, you begin to shrink, living in quiet grief, grieving not only who they are, but who you wanted them to be. Dr. Carol McBride, who specializes in narcissistic abuse recovery, says that survivors often live in chronic mourning, a psychological state where the loss never ends because the relationship never truly resolves. For some, staying becomes an act of emotional survival, detaching internally while maintaining the outward structure of the relationship. For others, leaving becomes the path to freedom, though it comes with the ache of missing the rare good moments. But psychologists agree. Almost every survivor who chooses to leave eventually reports a profound sense of relief once the fog lifts. Still, this process only works when you stop trying to reduce the story to heroes and villains, painting everything with a damning brush. As trauma specialists describe it, may feel satisfying in the moment, but it stunts emotional integration. You don't have to call someone a monster to hold them accountable. You just have to name their behavior as unacceptable and protect yourself from it. The reality is that narcissistic relationships exist in the gray zone, the murky, unglamorous middle ground that social media rarely talks about. Online spaces often sensationalize narcissism as pure evil, conflating it with psychopathy or sociopathy, conditions that affect less than 1% of the population. This distortion can harm survivors by deepening their shame. If they're not a monster, why am I still hurt? But as Dr. Craig Malkin notes, understanding the spectrum of narcissism helps survivors avoid oversimplification. It allows them to see that while narcissists may not be literal monsters, their patterns of behavior, manipulation, gaslighting, blame-shifting are still emotionally abusive and profoundly damaging. Seeing the gray doesn't mean forgiving the abuse. It means understanding the system, the psychological machinery behind the cruelty. It means recognizing that your confusion is valid, that your empathy is not weakness, and that those fleeting good moments are not proof of love, but psychological bait. Dr. Pete Walker calls this trauma bonding, where the victim's hope for redemption becomes the very chain that binds them to the abuser. The key to breaking it lies not in demonizing the narcissist, but in reclaiming your sense of self through therapy, boundaries, education, and self-compassion. Ultimately, healing from narcissistic abuse is not a straight path. It's a staircase. There is no elevator to wholeness. Every step, seeing the truth, mourning the illusion, setting boundaries, and learning to trust again, is slow and painful, but real. And while the world may shout words like evil or monster, your healing depends on softer truths, that people are complex, that pain can coexist with nostalgia, and that your clarity, not their chaos, is what will set you free.